I realized spiritual gifts have their limit. There was no amount of planning, researching online, or ChatGPT could change the situation. You know, when someone's sick, we think a lot about fairness, and then we ask, what is fair in this situation? Is it fair for my parents to live to 75, 85, 100? Like, what should the number be? What is right? And I struggle with this quite a bit. But God's perspective is different. In Isaiah 43:2, he says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you." We have no promises on our human lives, but we know God will always be with us. Hello, church. It's different because I can see everybody. So my name is Dan. I'm going to be giving just a short story, hopefully not too long. So growing up, I remember when my dad bought me my first computer. The first computers back then, the monitors are huge. It's like this big by this big, and when you turn it up, it was this really new fancy computer, right? It's called something Windows 3.1. I don't know, anyone here is really old like me. The first computers had no internet, believe it or not. But eventually, after many years, we got it. And you know how long it took to connect to the internet? About 2 minutes. Like, for anyone who's a bit younger, you can look in YouTube for some of those videos. But to show you how fast the internet was back then, it was a blazing what we call 56 kilobits per second. So to paint a picture on how it was back then, imagine a 10-minute video you watch on YouTube today. In the internet connection back then, it would take you 14 hours to watch that same video. Never to say, back then, we weren't watching videos back then. Having a computer back then was really privileged, and I grew up in a privileged family as it was rather expensive. You know, the computers didn't have that many apps or anything, so they had this cool thing called Ski Free, where you would ski down, and some moon would eventually eat you. I don't know. But mainly the two applications I used most were Microsoft Word and Excel, and amazingly enough, those applications still exist today. But the blessing was when my dad bought that computer, that introduced a small seed for me to get to the software field. So for those who don't know me, my family grew up in Southern California, where I went to a Vietnamese American church. Very long story short, after the Vietnam War in 1975, Southern California became the biggest population of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam because of the displacement of the refugees. It's not that different than the situation in Afghanistan that we seen a couple years ago. And to kind of paint the picture of how it looked like in Orange County, imagine going to a Safeway where all Vietnamese ingredients. For me, it was like, it's heaven still in Orange County. But, you know, growing up back then, I don't know if you had the similar situation. Church was kind of like a checklist. There were a bunch of things that I kind of felt that church made me want to check off. So, first check. Did you learn about the Sabbath? Check. Second check. Have you learned about the health message? Check. Third check. Have you learned about maybe some of the more complicated theology, like Day of the Dead? Check. And this style of church, I didn't hate it, but I didn't really love it. And it kind of felt like an obligation sometimes. But for my personality, where things have order, I don't need to think about things, it's kind of like an Excel sheet, and I was kind of okay with it. But if we're kind of honest with ourselves, when we went to church when we were young, a lot of us went because somebody made us do it, either our parents or our family. And at some point in time, we branch off. But oddly enough, it wasn't until my pastor back then who asked me to work on this new application called PowerPoint, and that I began developing a real interest in church. It was a really small task, but it was one of the first times of my exploration into church without my family. 1 Corinthians 12:1 and 4-6 talks about a pretty well-known story about spiritual gifts. So I'm going to read this really briefly. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. There are variety of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them all and everyone. We continue in 12:8-11. For to one is given the spirit of utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by one Spirit, to another the gift working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, and another the interpretation of tongues. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one who individually as he wills. So we've heard this probably sometimes. You have a spiritual gift, right? Maybe you are a healer, maybe you're a mission worker, right? We know traditional spiritual gifts are what we've learned in the church. But I have found my spiritual gift is OCD planning through Google Sheets and Docs. So hear me out now. I guarantee here everyone has a spiritual gift, because if mine can be kind of weird, like planning, I'm sure you have one too. So an example of my obsessive planning is when I travel. I know some of you are the adventurous type, just winging it and showing up and figuring things out. I remember talking to Jay at church. He was in Japan for, I think, a couple months, and it sounded like he kind of was winging it, and that's just like not my style. When traveling, I stage everything out, for better or for worse. So if I'm going anywhere, I will plan out this is what I do in the morning, this is what I do in the afternoon, this is what I do in the evening. And even if the plan doesn't happen, I have a reference point. Kind of the reason is too many times I've been caught in a situation where my partner and I want to visit something and it's closed. I'm like, oh no, it's closed, it's Monday, it's siesta day. I'm like, ah. So probably the most extreme example of this is we went to Iceland a while back, and I went full OCD mode and created a 60-page Google Doc with notes from Lonely Planet, Google Maps with pinned locations, and a detailed Google Sheet itinerary to visualize everything. So for those who think I'm kind of joking, every year we have a young adult retreat, and last year we went to Whistler, and I made everybody read a 22-page preparation document before they would go. The document contained, this is how you get to Whistler. If you missed your ride share, this is how you take the bus. If you get lost, this is what happens. And basically, it went to everything virtually close to like, here's 911 if nothing's on the dock. So eventually, kind of this like planning vibe, I got a computer science degree, which kind of further entrenched my interest in like logic and order. Pre-artificial intelligence, I think coding now is very different. Coding required visualizing dependencies and creating order out of chaos, out of thin air. Coding is this magical thing where you can make the computer do anything, and it's kind of like Excel or Google Sheets on steroids, right? But as much as I love planning and order, life is in a spreadsheet. And in 2023, my dad got sick. We think our parents are superheroes until one day we realize their mortality. I first saw this when my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer 10 years ago. It was a scare, and he had surgery, but he survived. But a couple years back, he was newly diagnosed with a colon cancer, which turned to a metastatic cancer. My dad was never the one to really know deep theology like those checklists. But towards the end of his life, what held him together was that he knew God was always with him. During that time in the hospital, it was Christmas time, and one of my friends was singing in a choir. This called her Nicole. She performed in this local choir, and she was great. And it was a good distraction of what's going on. Afterwards, I texted her and said, hey, sorry we couldn't meet after the choir. My dad's in the hospital. And then she began telling me about her experience about her dad in the hospital. What happened was her dad was getting older and really wrestled with the end of his life and did not go peacefully. And that haunted her, kind of that struggle on how someone would spend the last days. But my dad, despite knowing his end days, filled himself with the Holy Spirit. Like, don't get me wrong, theology is important, and knowing a lot of it helps. But the thing is, my dad didn't check all the nitty-gritty boxes of Adventism, but he loved God, he prayed, and relied on him, and he was just good with trusting in him. I realized spiritual gifts have their limit. There was no amount of planning, researching online, or ChatGPT could change the situation. You know, when someone's sick, we think a lot about fairness, and then we ask, what is fair in this situation? Is it fair for my parents to live to 75, 85, 100? Like, what should the number be? What is right? And I struggle with this quite a bit. But God's perspective is different. In Isaiah 43:2, he says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you." We have no promises on our human lives, but we know God will always be with us. So, when I go through times of stress, I blow off steam by playing tennis. I played tennis a lot when my dad is sick, and I still play a lot now, as we all have stress, right? There's something about hitting the ball over the net multiple times. It's kind of weird how that could relieve your stress. But there's nothing better than hearing the thwack of a clean ball with topspin over the net. There's this whoosh sound when your racket and your ball, when the contact is clean, that is just music to my ears. Because it's hard to play also during the day because people are working, but I have a flexible job, fortunately, and I take 2 p.m. breaks. Hopefully they're not watching this on air. Or 11 a.m. Just called out of office meeting at 11 a.m. And then I bought this ball machine. And in the ball machine, I can load 60 balls and play by myself. It's pretty cool. You can load an app, right? But since I was playing alone and taking an entire court, I was very self-conscious of going to a court when it was really busy. Because in Vancouver, if you play tennis, there's a lot of rules and formal and informal rules. So the actual rules, Vancouver has published guidelines for tennis courts. It states, courts are reserved exclusively for tennis. No other activities, including pickleball, are permitted. Sorry, pickleball players, if I see you, I'm going to point to this rule next time. The second rule, if other players are waiting, each court session is limited to 30 minutes, including warm-up. For about a month, I played solo at Heather Park. Sorry, I just let you know one of my secret courts, which is quite a good court. And I was the weird guy for a month because I was there by myself, taking a whole court, and I was just playing by myself, and other people came in. One time, one guy noticed, and he said, "Hey, you want to play with me?" And I was like, "Huh, that's really kind of you." And it reminds me of church. Sometimes we're here for weeks at church alone, but it's not until someone with the spiritual gift of hospitality invites us in like we're family. So what's kind of interesting is if you fast forward one chapter of that verse about spiritual gifts, it's the other verse we all hear about during weddings, which is 1 Corinthians 13:4. It goes, "Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy or boast, is not arrogant or rude." I'm sure you've heard this at least 100 times at every wedding. They always cite it, and then there's someone crying, and then it's like, oh, this is the best verse ever, and I don't know why they don't use other ones, but this is the most popular one. But when you kind of look at the context of 1 Corinthians 12 and 13, the foundation of spiritual gifts is actually love, is a prerequisite of all this. So like an Excel sheet with endless rows and columns and formulas, sometimes it just takes one cell that says, God's love is the foundation of faith no matter what happens. So as we sing our next song, Firm Foundation, let it be our declaration, no matter what happens when wrenches life thrown our way, Christ is our firm foundation. It's the rock we stand.